Hey there, it's Dr. Cam Sapon. Welcome to Maximus Call-In Radio Show, episode 37. Amazing how many episodes that we've gone through. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is our weekly call-in radio show where we answer any and all questions regarding mind, body, and masculinity and take written or live questions from the audience. We always also start with a weekly unpopular opinion, which I'm happy to share this week. But first, I want to just give a quick shout out to folks that are joining us on Discord. Let me know if you have any problems hearing. I know we've had some technical issues in the past, but hopefully we've resolved that from here on in. Thanks to everyone who's joining us on Instagram Live, on TikTok, on Twitter Spaces, and on Clubhouse. So we have a good crew of different platforms that we're hosting on. So we had a user submitted question from last week, and it kind of feeds into this week's unpopular opinion, which is the saying that there's no such thing as a biological free lunch is false. And I'll talk about why that is. So here's the question. Hey Doc, I've seen that you guys have released Enclomophene, and there seems to be really only upsides and no downsides compared to alternatives, and that are generally harder, quote unquote. This seems great, but I feel like there is no such thing as a biological free lunch, as Tim Ferriss puts it. So I'm wondering if there's any downsides or things to look out for before taking them. So there's actually a second part to this question, but I'll answer that part first. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of there's no such thing as a biological free lunch. What the heck does that mean? So a lot of you have heard the general expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch, which obviously refers to, look, there's nothing free in life, right? There's always a cost or a consequence to getting something for free. Now, when it comes to a biological free lunch, it's referring generally to the fact that you can't really take any drug without some significant side effect, consequence, or cost. And I think as a general heuristic, the problem is it's an oversimplification. I also think it's a little bit of a puritanical Calvinist point of view to think that there's always a downside, and essentially that implies that there's no such thing as something that's essentially safe. I don't think that's the case. So I think it depends on what you mean by a free lunch. So you can't obviously abuse drugs without significant downsides, but there's a couple factors that I think that's really important to consider when you're talking about, are there significant costs or consequences to taking any drug? And then I'll talk specifically about Enclomophene. So the first of all is not all drugs are the same. You cannot lump all drugs as being very similar to one another in terms of the cost and consequences they have. So I'll give you a couple relevant examples. So the form in which you take the drug makes a huge difference in terms of the impact and the so-called consequences of free lunch that it has. So cocaine is a great example actually of this. So in the original form, it's actually a plant in which you can take coca leaves, and it's traditionally brewed as a tea. When you take it in tea form, it has very mild stimulating qualities. That's not that different actually than a coffee or a yerba mate, which is both also sort of plant-based stimulants. Now it has a different mechanism of action in terms of being much more dopaminergic than caffeine is, which focuses more on the cyclical AMP receptor. But it's really, you can't really overdose on drinking coca leaves unless you're consuming massive quantities. Now, if you purify, obviously, the cocaine from the leaves, and then you snort it or inject it or freebase it in terms of crack cocaine, it's a very different mechanism of action, because basically the faster it hits your system, the more likely it is to be addictive. And so as a result of that, you're talking about the same drug, different delivery system, results in very different consequences, where you can literally have structural damage to your nose from excessively snorting cocaine, versus obviously that's not going to be a problem if you're just sipping a tea for the most part. Although who knows, maybe there's long-term sort of gum issues because it has a numbing effect. It is an anesthetic. So that's an example where even the delivery system of the drug makes a huge difference in terms of what the costs or consequences are. The second is Are you talking about something that's more of a precursor, or are you talking about something that is a direct agonist to the receptor? So I'll give you another example. We had a previous show where we talked about L-DOPA, which can also be found in a plant, this mung bean extract, essentially. And L-DOPA is essentially an amino acid that's the precursor to dopamine. Now, if you take it in that form, it's very likely that unlikely that you can overdo it in terms of increasing your dopamine levels, because there are enzymes that essentially convert L-DOPA into dopamine, and your body only produces so much of these enzymes. And so essentially there's a rate limiting step that prevents, you can take as much of these supplements as you want, but your body's just not going to convert it into dopamine. Some of you already have that experience with milk, right? So all of us produce also an enzyme called lactase, right? And lactase breaks down lactose, which is milk sugar, so that we can process it. Those people who are lactose intolerant don't have enough of lactase, and so they can't drink very much. They can maybe take small quantities of it. But even people who are European or come from any sort of ancestry that comes from a background where they've probably drank milk for 10,000s of years, not particularly lactose intolerant, but try drinking more than a gallon of milk in a day, and your enzyme will just give out, and you will basically be acutely lactose intolerant, right? And that's the way of the body's self-regulating. Essentially, it's saying, sure, you can consume milk, and I have enough enzyme for you to be able to process it, but you can't take too much. And then it prevents it from you're overdoing it and creating negative consequences for the system. However, when you take cocaine, there is no enzyme that's needed to convert it. There's no rate limiting step. It's a direct dopamine agonist. And so the more that you take, the more effect that it has, and it's very easy to overdo. So I was actually talking with one of our clinical advisors, Dr. Eugene Shippen, actually talking about this with even vitamin D, right? So when you're consuming, vitamin D, whether it's from the sun or from fish, it's almost impossible to get like vitamin D toxicity from the sun, because you're probably going to get a sunburn or you're just going to get tired from being outside in the sun. Most people, even like literally indigenous tribes that live outside all the time, their vitamin D levels are in like the 40s, right? They don't get vitamin D toxicity because they tan enough, and that's the rate limiting factor. And so they can't absorb more vitamin D. But if you take a vitamin D supplement in high dosages, you can actually get toxicity from it. And then if you take these prescription forms of vitamin D, it's even easier to theoretically overdo, because they saturate your serum levels faster and they don't need to be converted through any enzymes or other processes in the kidney or liver. So all this is to say, you can't say all drugs are the same. There are drugs that are very easy to overdo and overdose. There are drugs that are very hard to overdo and overdose. There's something, in fact, called an LD50, or what's the lethal dose that will kill 50% of the population that's taking it, and drugs vary wildly in terms of the LD50. So in terms of the consequences, it's stupid to say that all drugs, there's no such thing as a biological free lunch, because it really depends on the drug. Some are clearly the toxicity level makes a big difference. Second thing is not just the drug, but what's the dosage? In pharmacology, we always say the dose makes the poison, right? So it's not that all, like, certain drugs are inherently more poisonous than others. You can argue that based on the toxicity or the LD50, but the dosage makes a huge difference, right? So like caffeine is a really good example. Caffeine, most people, at least when they're consuming it in beverage form, like, don't overdose per se on caffeine, more than getting kind of overstimulated and not being able to sleep. But I'm talking about overdose in terms of like serious health consequences / death. Now, if you are taking it in pill form, or you're obviously taking it in powder form, it is possible to. In fact, that's one of the reasons why you can't generally buy. I think you can buy caffeine pills, but you can't buy powder online anymore, because there was someone who was measuring on a scale, skipped a decimal place, and took like 10 times the amount they were supposed to. So instead of like 200 milligrams, which would be like, a standard dose, maybe like 2 cups of coffee, was taking like 2,000 milligrams and kind of overdid it and probably significantly harmed themselves. So the dose really does make the poison. There's lots of people, in fact, caffeine is probably the most used drug in the world, without running into a lot of consequences because they take a relatively, reasonable dose. And there's not a lot of evidence, in fact, that it has negative long-term consequences, right? So I'd actually argue caffeine is probably the best example where if you're not letting it create adverse effects in terms of your anxiety or your sleep, and by the way, a lot of people just develop tolerance to, caffeine. They also sort of get used to it, right? Like I have friends who say I can drink cups of coffee before bed and doesn't affect my sleep at all, right? But that because they're not sort of caffeine naive or caffeine virgins. If you're taking a reasonable amount of caffeine long term, and especially in plant form, right, you're getting it from tea or coffee, there's no evidence that it has significant adverse effects, negative effects on mortality in terms of how long you live, etc. So you could actually argue caffeine is a great counterexample to the notion that there's no such thing as a biological free lunch, because there's clearly people who take it every day for decades, doesn't seem to shorten their lifespan, and they do get benefits. Like there's clear evidence showing that it enhances cognitive performance and even enhances athletic performance. High doses of caffeine were or may continue to be banned by sporting agencies like WADA, the World Anti-Doping Association, which regulates the Olympics, because caffeine is a performance-enhancing drug, both cognitively and athletically. The third factor that's really important in terms of why I don't agree with the notion of there's no such thing as a biological free lunch. It depends on the duration and the frequency in which you're taking something, right? There's lots of things that you can take short term. There's a clear benefit from it and not a lot of cost. Like a great example that a lot of people are familiar with are NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So these are the common over-the-counter anti-pain or anti-inflammatory medications you may be familiar with, like ibuprofen, or Advil is the brand name, or naproxen or Aleve are two examples. And obviously there's aspirin as well, and Tylenol. So these are, like literally, ubiquitous over-the-counter medications. Now, they do have risks, right? If you take these pain medications, over-the-counter pain medications on a regular basis, they can cause stomach ulcers, they can cause liver toxicity, and you can overdose. I think Tylenol overdose unfortunately kills something like 10,000 people a year. Now, some of those people are actually suicidal, and unfortunately, because of how ubiquitous it is and because of the LD50 that I talked about, they're purposely trying to poison themselves, which is obviously a sad state of societal affairs. But other than those people, if you think about, okay, there are long-term consequences to overdoing and taking it for too long. But if you have acute pain, right, like you injure yourself, you sprain your ankle on the basketball court, and it's just hurting, and you're just not able to work, you're not able to concentrate. Or another example, you just have a headache, right, and you're just not able to concentrate or do what you need to do that day. Is if you're a relatively healthy person with normal kidney and liver function, if you take, within the recommended guidelines under the, approval of your physician, a couple ibuprofen or naproxen just for a day in order to get through that day, you're probably not going to have negative health consequences. And the clear short-term effects of being functional that day in terms of being able to go to work and do what you need to do, I would argue, there you go. That is your free lunch. But it's only free because you're taking it just for a day, maybe a week to just get through an injury, but you're not taking it long-term. Sleeping medications are another great example of that. Is there such a thing as a biological free lunch with sleeping medications? Absolutely not. There are clear negative side effects to sleeping medications. That's why basically most of the Z hypnotics like Zolpidem, or the AKA brand name Ambien, which is probably the most common prescription sleeping medication that exists, literally says on the label, do not take for more than 2 weeks. Why does it say that? Because it creates tolerance, right? You have to take more and more of the medication to get the same effect. And it creates dependence. You become dependent on it, which is obviously something that you don't want to do when you already have sleeping issues. So not a great thing to obviously take long term. But what about short term, right? Like you have an exam the next day, huge presentation, a big interview, you cannot sleep, or you have a red-eye flight, and obviously it's super uncomfortable to sleep on that flight. You're not going to get any sleep. Under a doctor's supervision, if you take a sleeping medication once to get through that night versus not sleeping at all, is that have an adverse effect? For most people, it generally doesn't. And in fact, it counterbalances or outweighs the downsides of not sleeping. So you have to, that's the additional factor that people miss. Is there side effects to medication? Of course, there's side effects to all medication. But what's the side effect of not taking the medication? What's the side effect of basically having a giant migraine headache and being like, oh, I don't touch drugs? Well, you have a side effect of like throbbing pain and dealing with the negative neuroinflammation that's associated with that. What's the side effect of not sleeping, especially if you're talking about getting less than 5 hours of sleep a night? Also associated with acute inflammation systemically, which has negative physiological effects. So what's worse, the side effects of the medication or the side effects from not sleeping? That's something that you and your doctor have to balance. But when you say there's no such thing as a biological free lunch, I would also argue there's no such thing as a biological free lunch to going untreated and letting a acute or sometimes chronic health issue basically go untreated. Same thing with SSRIs. Not really great, medication in terms of superiority to placebo. And there's obviously downsides in terms of black box warnings in terms of suicidality. But if you have, let's say, severe depression and there's a clear risk of suicidality if you don't get treated, not to mention the shitty quality of life that you had, I think it's very clearly indicated that it's quite beneficial in those patients, right? Because the trade-off of not being on the medications is quite adverse or much worse than any of the potential SSRI side effects, which can also, by the way, be mitigated through adjunctive co-administration of other things that can help the sexual side effects like a Wellbutrin or things like that. So that's a really important factor as well. The third factor is really the duration and frequency in which you take things, because acute versus long-term administration has different effects in the body. Things build up in the body over time. There's downregulations of receptors over time with some drugs and some not. In fact, there's upregulation, interestingly, of receptors. Some drugs have tolerance and dependence effects, as I mentioned, that accumulate over time. Some drugs don't. It just works on different systems in the body. The final, I think, really important factor in terms of whether or not there's a biological free lunch is there's just a huge amount of individual variability, right? So I'll give you a couple different examples of this. It depends on your age, right? People who are still developing, children, teenagers, in terms of the effects on their body and their brain, they tend to be more sensitive to drugs. Generalization, but directionally true. Versus, when you're a little bit older, the consequences of these things are less because your growth plates are fused. It's not going to negatively affect your growth, etc. The other thing is genetics. There are some people who can just weirdly tolerate massive amounts of drugs with not a lot of side effects. God bless those people, and do okay. An interesting example is people who lack versus have the I believe it's called the alcohol dehydrogenase 2 enzyme. This is commonly known as the Asian glow, right? So people who lack these enzymes have a difficulty breaking down alcohol, and more of a toxic metabolite accumulates and they get that red glow or flush in their face. Now, you could argue, like from an acute toxicity perspective, those people they don't hold their liquor, so to speak, very well, and they get more toxic, they get more sick, they're more likely to throw up, black out, all those kinds of negative adverse effects in the short term, right? So you think, oh, this is a curse. Interestingly, long term, Asian populations who lack this have much lower rates of alcoholism. Why is that? Because, well, obviously when you get sick from drinking, you're less likely to do it again and again on a long-term basis. Versus you think about more of a Northern European ancestry that has like a long-standing history and culture with drinking. Like you think about like an Irish population, for instance, where going to the pub is very socially normative. They can hold their liquor pretty well. They have a lot of this alcohol dehydrogenase. So short-term, it's great for them because they don't get super drunk. And they don't throw up and they don't get super sick. But long term, the rates of alcoholism amongst those populations that are hard drinking, Irish, Russian, kind of cultural populations where there may have been like an adaptation genetically that's happened, have much higher rates of alcoholism. So that's a really interesting thing, right? So who has the biological free lunch there, the Asians or the Europeans? It's sort of unclear. It talks about the time frame. I would say it's advantageous in the short term to have the enzyme. In the long term, it's not advantageous. The other factor that I think people negate is lifestyle, right? If you have a very healthy lifestyle and proper diet, exercise, sleep, your liver and kidneys are processing, food well, you can mitigate a lot of the negative biological consequences, right? So, like for instance, certain drugs may have adverse effects on like your lipid levels or your blood cholesterol levels. But if your blood cholesterol is perfect, if you shift it up and down 10%, it's going to have no difference in outcome. Versus, let's say you're pre-diabetic, right? Your blood sugar level's high. It's like 115, let's say. And then you take some medication that increases your blood sugar to 126. Now you've exceeded the threshold or the cutoff for type 2 diabetes. You're going to be on your way to exacerbating your insulin resistance, and your doctor is going to want to put you on a type 2 diabetes medication like metformin. And so for this person, a 10-point increase in blood sugar has a pretty negative adverse effect. Versus if you're in perfect biological health, you're like a Hadza tribesman and you have your blood sugar levels 85 on a fasting level. Going from 85 to 95, no difference in terms of like long-term negative cardiometabolic risk factors. So I think that also shows that it depends on your lifestyle. If you have poor lifestyle, the consequences of you just pushing you over the edge in terms of your health risk is much greater, versus if you're in picture perfect health, you almost have like more buffer or room, quite frankly, to endure consequences or side effects. The other key factors are their drugs. There's something called polypharmacy. When you're taking different drugs together, they can have sort of unknown interactions or combinations. We do actually have drug databases nowadays where if you go to any pharmacy, they ask what medication you're on and make sure there's no clear known contraindications. But with all the crazy supplements that people take these days that are like not very well studied, not very well characterized, we don't know a lot of these combinations. And also when you start taking 3 or more combinations together, we don't know what the effect of those, because there's very few studies where they've tested 3 things together. So that also has basically unknown sort of consequences, and it may in fact sometimes be bad in terms of it creates a contraindication, or sometimes it may be good because maybe that supplement is actually lowering your blood glucose or protecting your liver in some way, and it lets you kind of counterbalance some of the consequences or side effects of it, right? Like we actually use this principle positively as part of the Maximus protocol. So enclomophene not only increases testosterone, but it increases estradiol as well, or estrogen, because testosterone converts to estrogen. So as a result, in order to make sure that the estrogen doesn't go too high, we use a supplement called calcium D-glucarate, aka calcium saccharate, which helps flush out excess estrogen in your system. It also flushes out excess xenoestrogen. So these are the artificial estrogens that you're getting from the environment, from all the plastics and contamination and pollution that we get from our environment. And so it helps mitigate the damage from that sort of, not just the drug, but the external drugs that we're not supposed to be getting from our plastics and drinking water and Teflon and clothes. So that also makes a big difference as well in terms of if there's other drugs or other supplements that you're taking. So long story short, I actually disagree with the notion that there's no such thing as a biological free lunch, because it depends on the drug, depends on the dosage, depends on the duration, and it depends on individual factors as well. And so I think it makes sense as a rule of thumb. The last thing I would say too is it depends on what the drug is doing. Is the drug taking you to like a super physiological or superhuman level of functioning, or is it just correcting something? So I'll give you some examples. Obviously, when you do cocaine, you're doing a high amounts of Adderall and you don't have ADHD. The amount of dopamine that's flowing through your brain is not anywhere normal or human for the most part, right? Different if you're like low dopamine in the first place, like I said. But you're taking a huge amount. And another example of that is like anabolic steroids or sort of non like sports so-called levels of TRT, in which you can get your testosterone levels into the 3,000 to 5,000 range. No human being is really above like 1,000, maybe 1,200 naturally, right? If you're talking about pushing your level, your biology to a point that's 3 to 5 times normal, like no human being is literally walking around with that level of dopamine or testosterone. Yes, there's no such thing as a biological free lunch, because you're not even human at that point, and the body doesn't even know how to regulate something like that. As opposed to the Maximus protocol, if you watch the video that's on our website, I talk about how there's been a decrease in testosterone over the last 50 years, right? It's gone down 50% in terms of total testosterone, 65% in terms of bioavailable testosterone. And what does our protocol do? It doubles your testosterone levels. So if you just do the quick math in your head, if it's gone down by half and then you double it, we're actually putting you to the levels where you should have been in the first place. So in fact, your grandfather 50 years ago probably had the same testosterone levels as a guy does who's on the Maximus King protocol. So we're not pushing people above like physiological levels if you're comparing it to a historical baseline or comparing it to healthy young men who are in great shape, right? If you compare it to a bunch of average middle-aged obese men, which is unfortunately what the new reference ranges have become, then yes, it looks slightly super physiological. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Dr. Eugene Shippen, one of our advisors. The reference ranges on our labs for free testosterone in terms of what's the normal range between the 2nd and a half and 97th and a half percentile is about, I believe it's like somewhere around between 50 and 150, right? So 50 being the lowest end of normal, 150 being the highest end of normal, and 100 being average, right? But when I asked him, like what's too much? Is going above 150, although it's technically the 97th and a half percentile, is that too much? Because we do have people on our protocol that achieve levels around 200, right, which is above the reference range. But he said, no, that's not the case. If you look at the data, for instance, if you look at 19 to 39-year-old healthy, young, non-obese men, right? So these are like prime, healthy, if you want to call them alpha males, but this is like the peak of society, right? You're never going to have higher testosterone levels when you're young, healthy, in great health, and you're non-obese. The 97th and a half percentile for a guy in that ideal condition is like 220, 230, in fact. It's much higher than the 150 reference range in the lab, which includes like 80-year-old very sick men. You shouldn't be comparing yourself to an 80-year-old sick man in terms of your testosterone levels. You should be comparing it to a healthy young man if you are otherwise a healthy young man. So in his, he has something called a nomograph. It's like a chart of looking at what your free testosterone levels would be. He actually argued that the up to 250, in fact, is still within the normal range of free testosterone, right? Because he's comparing it again to a healthier population in terms of what it should be. So that who you're comparing it to also makes a very big difference. And no matter what, we're kind of keeping people well within the realm of normality. Now, if we put people on massive dosages, which we don't do, we're super conservative in terms of our clinicians, then yes, there is a possibility of adverse effects or consequences, but we just don't do that because we're not in the drug abuse game, or we're in the clinical treatment game in terms of making sure that we're getting people to optimal levels that is still within the realm of possibility. Now, if you're abusing, obviously, TRT, you're abusing steroids, it's a totally different comparison. It doesn't apply to what we're doing at all. And there is no biological free lunch if you're trying to be Superman. And that's what bodybuilders are doing, right? They're trying to put on 10 pounds of muscle per month, which is like no human being on earth, even if you're an Olympic athlete, has the ability to do that. And that's why it's not useful to compare the two. So I'll just end on this note. I'll ask the second part of the question. So that's the end of our unpopular opinion. I'll answer the second part of the question. I'm more curious just on enclomophene itself and SERMs as a category, mainly due to the popularity of SARMs and TRT online. And I've never heard of enclomophene SERMs. And if you can go to depth about what they are and why the bet on them. Either way, congrats on the launch, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it and considering it as well. Just wanted to get a bit more information before I started taking them. Okay, so I think this is a really great question, and let's even though the two terms sound similar, they're actually quite different in terms of what they do, in terms of their safety, and why one of them does not have a biological free lunch, and the other one does, as far as we know. So SERMs are selective estrogen receptor modulators. SARMs are selective androgen receptor modulators. So you have receptors all over your body for estrogen or estradiol and androgens, right? So testosterone and its derivatives like DHT and are agonists to the androgen receptor, while estrogens like estradiol, estrone, etc., agonize the estrogen receptor. So we're talking about totally different receptors in which these drugs work. Now, also, they have the opposite action. So a SARM is basically an oral steroid, right? They function exactly like anabolic androgenic steroids. The only difference is that they're more selective, and so the anabolic to androgenic ratio is different than, let's say, testosterone. So testosterone, being the classic example, has a anabolic to androgenic ratio of 1 to 1, right? In terms of the effects. The anabolic effects are the classic kind of like muscle building effects that guys typically want if they're bodybuilders. The androgenic effects are like beard growth, oily skin, acne, growth of prostate. They're masculinizing, if you will, but you don't necessarily want too much of the androgenic effects because you don't want your prostate to grow and get urinary symptoms where, you have to go to the bathroom a couple times a night. So testosterone and TRT, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. They've developed SARMs like LGD4033 that have a anabolic to androgenic ratio that's 100 to 1, which is pretty amazing, right? If you think about it, it's like all the anabolic benefits that people generally want without the negative androgenic benefits. So that being said, it's still basically a steroid. And that means that there is no such thing as a biological free lunch because, number one, it's suppressive, just like testosterone and any other steroid is. So SARMs are suppressive. There's a lot of miscommunication, misinformation out there on Reddit claiming that, if you just do a short cycle or you do a low dose, it's not suppressive. They're absolutely suppressive. The data is absolutely clear. If you looked at the lab result, there's people who their testosterone plummets to 0 or like 100 when they're on, in terms of total testosterone, when they're on a SARM. So that's why, just like most steroids, people do not take them for more than like 8 to 12 weeks because it shuts down your own testosterone production. It shrinks your balls. It creates infertility. All the negative effects of steroids. They're still there, even though the anabolic to androgenic ratio is beneficial. Second, it shuts down your SHBG. So SHBG, your sex hormone binding globulin, decreases by half, which, a lot of guys, it's high in. And so they're like, oh, that's a positive beneficial effect. But, there's a Goldilocks zone to these enzymes. You don't want it to go down to 0. It has negative effects. It's just like estrogen. Estrogen in guys, it needs to be controlled. But when estrogen is actually too low, you start actually getting libido side effects. So you don't want to shut down your SHBG completely. And then third, it has a classic effect that other steroids have, which is it really messes with your lipids, right? So your cholesterol, LDL, HDL, etc., decreases HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, significantly increases LDL, and messes even with a small particle size LDL that's more associated with cardiovascular disease. So there really is no such thing as a free lunch with SARMs. The only reason, quite frankly, that SARMs are popular is because they're an easy way to get oral steroids online. That's it. And they haven't been shut down by the FDA yet. They're currently shutting it down. In fact, if you go, I was telling our producer today that if you go to these websites, they're like, we're not selling these anymore. This is the last batch. They're going to be discontinued after we run out. That's because the FDA has come knocking on their door and they told them, stop selling this stuff. They're not FDA approved. These have never been used. They're like basically research chemicals that have not been used in more than a couple hundred humans. And they're very risky, like in terms of the suppression that I talked about and the negative side effects in terms of SHBG and lipids. So SARMs are just, the new hot designer steroids for all intents and purposes. And people are interested because obviously they want to put on a lot of muscle really quickly, despite the negative consequences. Furthermore, these are research chemicals that are made illegally by biotech pharma companies in China. You have no idea if they're actually selling you what you think they are. You might be thinking you're getting one SARM, you're getting another SARM. You may be getting just a steroid. And you think it's a SARM because it's easier for them to produce. You don't know if it's pure. You don't know if there's heavy metal toxicity, none of that stuff. That's why I always tell people, don't take any drugs that are not produced from a legitimate pharmacy and it's pharmaceutical grade because it's just too much of a health risk. I think SARMs you should basically only take at your own risk, quite frankly. We would never recommend them, and it's illegal. There's no legitimate company that sells them. On the other hand, SERMs, which is what have been FDA approved since at least 1967, very well characterized. hundreds of research studies. Enclomophene is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, but it actually antagonizes it. So while SARMs agonize or hit the receptor, it actually blocks, SERMs block the receptor. And what that does when you block the estrogen receptor is it tells the body, oh, I'm not getting enough estrogen. And how does the body produce estrogen? It converts testosterone to estrogen. So it stimulates the Leydig cells in the testes or your testicles to produce more LH or luteinizing hormone, which in turn produces more testosterone. And so it actually stimulates your own body's natural production. So while SARMs shut down your endogenous testosterone production in terms of your internal production of testosterone, SERMs actually stimulate it. So it literally has the opposite effect. So while SARMs shut you down and shrink your testicles and cause infertility, SERMs stimulate your own natural production. They actually increase testicular volume according to one study in higher dosages, and they maintain or increase fertility. So even though the acronyms are very similar, SARMs versus SERMs, they are totally different drugs. They literally have the opposite effects. And also one is illegal and the other one's legal. And the side effect profiles are totally different. While I mentioned the research shows on SERMs, like enclomophene, that the side effect profile is no different than placebo in terms of clinical trials. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't side effects. That all drugs have side effects, but the side effects are very a few. Like they typically only happen in like 1% of the population, and they're relatively mild, right? So if you look at, I'll actually read through the studies. In the clinical trials, these are the following side effects for enclomophene. Headache was observed in 3.3% of patients, nausea in 2.1% of patients, diarrhea in 1.9% of patients, getting the common cold in 1.7% of patients, hot flashes in 1.7% of patients, joint pain in 1.2% of patients, and dizziness in 1% of patients. So you're talking about really common vague symptoms like a headache, nausea, dizziness in 1 to 3% of patients. And if you give people a placebo, a sugar pill, guess what? They have the same reported side effects. So is it really from the medication, or is it just because if you poll 100 people, 1% of them are going to have a random headache? By the way, this is the hilarious thing about the common cold. Obviously, enclomophene does not cause a cold. That's like physiologically impossible. It's a virus that spreads, through your upper respiratory tract. Is it possible that it makes it more conducive to getting the common cold? Maybe, if it's immunosuppressive. But the reality of that 1.7% is it probably just was like winter season, people got more colds. But like I said, no different than placebo. So I would actually argue that enclomophene in the relative safety profile of drugs is the closest thing to a biological free lunch as you can get, because there isn't a lot of tolerance that develops, there isn't a dependence that develops, side effects are minimal, and there is no significant adverse events that happen that required people to drop out of the clinical trials. So while there's always risks and potential issues with any medication, in the relative scheme of things, especially compared to something like a SARM or a steroid, it is much better tolerated. The risks are much lower, and it can be taken safely by healthy young men, which is what the research studies say. If you look up the research studies, it says blah, 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 can be taken by healthy young men. And there's studies that have shown that, for instance, Clomid, its parent drug, has been taken safely for 3+ years without any adverse effects. So that's hopefully a deep dive a little bit on the upsides, risks, and mechanisms of enclomophene and why SERMs are very different than SARMs, and you shouldn't confuse the two.
We had a comment on Twitter. Isn't enclomophene just a version of Clomid and is only used when someone is getting off steroids?
Enclomophene is an isomer of Clomid. It's 62% of Clomid, the other 38% being zuclomophene. So you shouldn't say it's just that. It's actually a pretty significant difference. So it is 2/3 of Clomid, but the other third makes a huge difference in that zuclomophene is an estrogen receptor agonist, right? And so as we talked about, it hits the receptor. So it has very strong estrogenic effects. And so a lot of the side effects that people get from Clomid are plausibly due to the presence of Zuclomophene. And so when you talk about high dose Clomid, people do report mood effects, libido effects, ocular effects in terms of visual distortion that they get, and it's most likely due to the Zuclomophene isomer. In fact, I've tried looking at the research literature on Enclomophene. There's no reported ocular effects that we know of, at least. And so while in Clomid, it's pretty apparent that you put people on high dosages, especially like 50 milligrams of Clomid, a lot of people will get ocular side effects. So they're very similar drugs, but like I said, you can't, this is the problem with generalizations. You look at two drugs and say, oh, they're similar. Aren't they just the same thing? No, they're not, because Clomid is really two drugs together. That you have to think about it that way. And Enclomophene is basically one of those two drugs. It's the one of them that works. That's why they purified it, so they can have the positive upsides without the downsides of that second drug, which is not only necessary, but it's probably causing a lot of the side effects. And so they really shouldn't be. They're really not the same thing in terms of the side effect profile. They are similar in terms of the effect on testosterone because they do share the Enclomophene isomer. So that's basically the main difference, and that's why we focus on using Enclomophene.
We had a different question from YouTube. This one has to do with young men and psychology. 52% of young adults live with their parents. What long-term positive and negative effects will this have on young men? What advice would you give to men living with their parents in becoming or trying to become more independent?
Yeah, this is a great question. So this is a question about the recent trend and phenomenon of young men increasingly living with their parents. I don't think there's an easy or quick answer to this question because of the financial situation that especially young men encounter. I think back in the day, people generally at the age of 18, maybe 22, basically almost automatically sort of moved out, established, personal and financial independence, started their careers, started their families, and went and bought a house, right? And so I would say if you have the means to move out, especially financially, and try to establish yourself, I generally think it's a good idea to do so. And the reason for that is because earlier generations, because they were forced to grow up really quick at 18 to kind of 20 to 22, essentially are much more mature at that age versus current generations, right? I always share the anecdote that J-Lo says that men under the age of 33 are generally worthless. And it's kind of a harsh statement, I have to say, J-Lo, but sadly, I partly agree with her in that there's such a delayed adolescence that has happened to young men where 33 is the new 22. It takes an extra 11 years for men to grow up because they tend to either be continuing to live at home or be living subsidized in dormitories or graduate schools, and they never really sort of grow up. So I think if you have either the financial means or kind of the will, quite frankly, maybe you don't have the financial means, but you're like, you know what? I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to go work. I'm going to get a part-time job. I'm going to pay my rent. I want to establish independence. I actually think psychologically and from a maturity standpoint, it's better. Why? Because you learn to take care of yourself. Men need to learn to take care of themselves. Every man should know how to cook their own food in a way that's healthy and sustainable. When you're at home, who cooks your food? Your parents do, right? It's too convenient for you to do it otherwise. You need to be able to look after yourself, clean your room, do your laundry, all these kind of basic life tasks, which even in the long term, you may not do forever. Hopefully you get to a point of, a financial benefit where you have a house cleaner and someone doing your laundry. But even then, I think it's useful to be able to know how to do things because it's just basic life tasks. And also, being able to balance your checkbook, establish financial independence, they're all kind of positive things. And the earlier you can do them, the better. Now, there is a counter argument to this. The counter argument to this is that nowadays it's so expensive. Like most young people will never buy a home. This is really sad to say because they're priced out of the market, particularly if you're in markets like California where the average home is like $1 million plus, right? People are going to be generally renting forever. So what's the incentive for them to sort of leave home sort of early? And also rents are sky high. So even if you're renting, right, like in West LA, like a one bedroom is $3,000 a month. So unless you're taking home a significant amount of change, right? That's $36,000 after tax. That basically means pre-tax you need to be making 50, 60K a year. That's basically a college grad's first year income, right? So you barely have any money to pay your rent and pay for food. And so you're basically not saving any money. And so the argument is, wasn't it better to stay at home with your parents? You'll save rent and be able to save up. Yeah, I think in that case, it could be plausible in order to do that, to save a little bit of money so that you can obviously take the next steps in terms of your progression. But it is probably coming, ironically, as a no such thing as a free lunch, your personal and social development in terms of getting out of the house, learning independent life skills, improving your social life, improving your dating life too. By the way, that's a huge downside that I think it's unique to men. Women are generally not negatively regarded if they still live at home with their parents, particularly in a lot of protective sort of cultures in which it's quite frankly the norm. Like you stay at home with your parents until you're married, right? And you can argue whether that's a good or bad thing, but it is quite culturally normative, and I don't think it's it's useful to judge the cultures, a lot of cultures in fact that do that. But for men, generally on the dating market, if you don't have your own place, even if you have roommates, but you still live at home with your parents, you are judged negatively for it. And so you can argue that's not fair. Why are men judged more harshly for it? It is what it is. This is a radical acceptance of reality. So you may be forgiven for it more, I would say, at the age of 22 if you still live at home with your parents, because maybe the girls that you're dating are between the ages of 18 to 22 and they're still living at home with their parents. So they're going to judge you less. But basically, the sooner you get up in age, you're turning 25, you're turning 30, now you're 35. If you're still living at home with your parents, above 30, especially above 35, the women are going to think, what's wrong with you, right? They're going to be like, this person has had 10, 15 years to establish financial savings and independence, and they're still not doing it, right? At 22, you can make that argument. Or maybe even in your early 20s, you're like, I'm going through med school or residency, and I'm getting paid $20,000 to $40,000 a year. It's not enough to live off of. So yeah, I'm going to be a starving student, live at home for my parents for a few years and make it work. But if you're not making more than 20 to 40K in your 30s, you've failed essentially in terms of the social hierarchy game. And so the earlier I think you can establish that financial independence, move out of your parents' home, the better. So I guess that's a more nuanced answer to your question. It depends on your situation. If you're in an expensive area, you're more likely to be able to do it. If you're making a low income because of being a student or kind of going through residency or training, I think it becomes more appropriate to do it. And if you're much, much younger, right? If you're talking like 18 to 22, maybe for a few years after that, up to 25, I would say it's more socially acceptable to do it. But I would very much argue that especially after the age of 25 and absolutely by 30, you need to be out of your parents' house, living independently. Otherwise, you're just delaying your maturity and you're delaying your ability to climb the social hierarchy. You are and will be judged for it. So I think it's better to do your best and get out of your parents' house. So one last thing I'll leave you with is a Tony Robbins anecdote. He talked about when he was not the famous Tony Robbins and he was just hustling, going from one workshop to the next, trying to make a living. He would inspire himself by driving around this wealthy suburb, looking at these beautiful houses. And he was like, I want to have one of these one day. And then in order to push himself, he actually bought a house that he couldn't afford. He barely qualified for the mortgage. And he was like, man, I got to make a consistent amount, whatever thousands per week in order to afford this place and not default on my loan. But he was like, at that point, there was no turning back. He had to make the money. And so he did it. And so that's the same thing with moving out of your parents' house. When you know you have a certain amount of rent due every month, otherwise you're getting kicked out by your landlord, it's going to motivate you to be on time, to do a good job at work, to keep that paycheck going. A lot of people think that's like financial handcuffs. I think that's a negative way of looking at it. I think it's financial freedom because it's pushing you to make a decent amount of money. And it's something you got to do anyway, right? It's not forcing you to do something you shouldn't be doing anyway. I think the problem is living at your parents' house is basically akin to the carnivorous island if you ever watched the movie Life of Pi. It's so seductively comfortable. It's never going to push you to be great. You need to be a little hungry. You need to have a little pressure to be great. And that's the where the expression, only pressure makes diamonds come from. You need a little pressure in your life, and quite frankly, healthy pressure is what makes a boy into a man. So get out of your parents' house and become a man.
Would you say J-Lo was right?
I think J-Lo is often right for men of this generation, but I think what we're trying to do with Maximus Tribe is help men grow up faster. That's why we give this sort of life counseling and advice and guidance on this call-in radio show, and we help men optimize their testosterone so that they can at least be on equal level with their grandparents who were starting their lives at 18 to 22, but they had double your testosterone levels. No wonder they were more motivated. As I've said previously, testosterone makes effort feel good, right? So when he's like fighting his way through the Great Depression, trying to hustle, get married, pay his, mortgage and support 2 kids at the age of 22, he had the testosterone and to have the mental and testicular fortitude to go do that. If your testosterone is not optimal, you're going to be like, nah, man, I'm going to stay at home and play video games. So let's correct that, which is what we're doing here, and provide you the right guidance in order to make better decisions so that when you are 33 or beyond 33, you're the kind of guy that women like J-Lo are going to be like, man, that's a man, and that's the kind that I want to go after.
We had another question via YouTube. This is actually a repeated question from a previous stream. How does one balance dialectic thoughts and identity truth?
Identify truth. How does one balance dialectic thoughts and identify truth? That's kind of it's a very philosophical question. I think we might have actually answered this on a previous one, so I won't go into depth on this one. But this is kind of, it goes into the earlier conversation. I'm a huge fan of being an amateur scientist. Right. So how do you find truth? You look for data, and there's lots of ways of looking for data. You can look for sources. I think there's a common meme out there that, like, I don't know, the average midwit doesn't believe anything unless there's a source or a research paper. I actually think it's a good thing. We've gotten to a point of our society where we just don't randomly believe every huckster or soapbox salesman on the street. So I would say do your research. You want to identify truth? Are there published research studies that say this supplement or this drug is safe and effective, right? So I think that's a very useful rule of thumb. And if there isn't, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect, but in science, we believe the null hypothesis, which is until there is evidence, you don't believe it's true, because otherwise you're going to go test 1,000 different supplements that potentially increase testosterone. Your life is too short for that. Now, there are some instances in which you can individually test things. So you're basically being an amateur scientist and saying, I'm going to do a case control study. I'm going to test my testosterone levels before. I'm going to do whatever intervention there is, and I'm going to test them after 30 days. And I'm basically doing my own study. And that's fair too, right? So that's the other thing I would say is if there isn't enough research and you want to validate it or you want to revalidate it for yourself, then great. Do that, but do it in a way that's scientific. So I honestly think science or the scientific method, aka empiricism, is the best way of identifying truth that we have found. It doesn't mean that science or the scientific method is perfect, but even we update our methods, right? There are better statistical techniques that we even come up with. There's better experimental methodologies that we come up with. So even science itself gets better, and that's the beauty of the process. And I still think it's the best way of identifying truth. It's not the only way of identifying truth, but if I had to bet on it and its imperfections over any other thing, which is a blind faith or trial and error, I think it's clearly superior.
We had a follow-up question on the individual who asked about young men still living with their parents. This is actually a personal question. How did you become a life coach / therapist to CEOs and startup founders? Where on LinkedIn did you apply for that job?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I never call myself a life coach or a therapist. I think those are terrible terms. First of all, therapist is not a regulated term. Anyone can call themselves a therapist. You can call yourself a therapist. You can call yourself a life coach. It's honestly a meaningless, non-regulated term. And so if anyone calls themselves a life coach or advertises themselves as a therapist, they're probably not legit, because it's meaningless. the term psychologist or the term psychiatrist is a legally protected term. That means you got a doctorate degree and you have a license to practice as a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So I always try to avoid that term as much as possible. I occasionally will use the word therapy or psychotherapy as a process, but I don't refer to myself as a therapist. I'm a psychologist, right? And so I specifically say I'm an executive psychologist. And sometimes I'll use the term, I do coaching. I'll use it as a verb, but it's not a noun in terms of, it's not how I identify myself. It's not my professional role. So it's an important distinction. But yeah, I would say don't aspire to be a life coach or therapist, because you don't even need to go to school for that. You can just make it up and no one will believe you anyway. But how do you become a psychologist or psychiatrist to CEOs and startup founders? It was never part of a master plan. There is no job on LinkedIn that you apply for. I don't do it as a job. It's a private practice. So there was nothing to apply for in the first place. I had a private practice since I've been licensed for over a decade. And it happened organically, to be honest with you. And the reason is people want to work with people who are credible, not just in terms of their license, right? Like I'm like, okay, great. I went to UCLA and Harvard, the #1 graduate school and colleges in the country for psychology, and have a license to practice. So that provides credibility. But number two, what credibility do you have in terms of, providing guidance to startup founders and CEOs? Well, this is the third company that I've helped start. And I've been on founding teams or CEOs of those companies. And so it's much more credible to work with someone who's both a licensed psychologist and has been a startup CEO. And it's very rare to have that combination. And so the people who started coming to me were, of course, startup CEOs and VCs, the two people that I hang out with the most professionally, because I've been an investor and a founder. And so as a result of that, people wanted to come with me because I was in their community, I was networking with them, and I had credibility with them because I'm literally in their shoes. And so, yeah, it just happened organically, not even by design. But I love working with those folks because it's a cool niche, and I'm one of the rare people who's sort of like been on both sides of the couch, both as a psychologist and CEO. And as Mark Suster says, and I say as well, the job of a CEO and a VC is basically be chief psychologist. Like if you're running a company, all you do is manage people's psychology or assess people in terms of hiring. I spent today like doing a lot of hiring. It's basically playing psychologist in a lot of ways. In a different context, we're not necessarily analyzing or treating anyone, but it's dealing with people, and dealing with people is inherently psychology. So I feel very blessed to have that background in training and education and get to apply it in making sure I'm hiring great people and keeping the people that I have super happy. Excellent. All right, ladies and gentlemen, wonderful radio show today. We had a weekly unpopular opinion that was talking about the difference between SERMs and SARMs, and more importantly, the notion that there's no such thing as a biological free lunch. And I was disputing that and talking about how the different drugs, dosages, durations, and individual differences actually make that untrue. Had some great questions about whether young men should live with their parents or move out. Talked a little bit about using the scientific method or empiricism in terms of identifying truth, and how I ended up becoming a executive psychologist to CEOs and VCs. So great questions this week, spanning physiology to psychology. I always love sort of stretching the boundaries between mind and body. If you have additional questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. We will save them and then get to them next Thursday at 6 o'clock Pacific time. Same time, bat time, same bat channel. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful week.